Yes, hello again. After a week off to recover from the flu and the madness that was Evo, it is time for another Pichy and Palscast. No guests this week. I'll be having Pichy and Palscast regular Fire Rider on next week to talk about Ozado Nationals and some stuff. But I haven't done a solo show yet, and I wanted to get a good test of how long I would go just by running through my general list of topics without guests for once. A lot of things have happened since the last show. There was this little fighting game competition in some desert in America called Evolution. You probably haven't heard of it. I don't think it's very popular. And apparently a bunch of cool games happened there, so I'll be talking about that. This weekend, that just passed, was a much more local and far more important event. AvCon, the Anime and Video Games Festival, as it is often known as these days, to get better approval from things like council events. And as I've probably mentioned before on the show, I've been involved with AvCon for a long time, and I like to be involved with the competitive side of things there, because although you don't always get super high level competition and it's always a bit slapdash and the prizes aren't particularly good, it is a good way of getting your finger on the pulse of what people who aren't rocking up to fighting game events, how many people are actually interested in certain games, which ones are blowing up, if there's some cultural gaps that need to be addressed, that sort of thing. And so I'll be going over that as well. In fact, I think I'll actually start with AvCon first. This is probably the most low-key year I've had with involvement in the con in about 10 years. So I actually got to spend some time looking around at things for a while. I didn't get to play any board games because all the tournaments were on at the same time I was running fighting games, so I didn't get to play, say, in the Seven Wonders tournament, which I would have liked to do. Wanted to grind out some games of Scythe and see how my builds go against other players in the state, but that was not meant to be. I did get to go to the Indie Games room for a while, though, which has been a feature of the convention for quite some time now, and there's quite a lot of interesting talent on display. If you're familiar with the game Screen Cheat, that popped up at the Indie Games room for a number of years. That's a multiplayer first-person shooter where you can't actually see yourself or your opponents, so you have to actually look at other people's screens in order to see what's happening. So the first game that I played at the Indie Games room, while looking around, was a game called Space. That's S-P-A-A-A-C-E. And it had a little rocket ship in the logo. And I haven't really mentioned this on the show, but I'm a big fan of space sims. I loved Wing Commander as a kid. I enjoyed Free Space, Freelancer. I quite liked the game Everspace recently, which is a roguelike, which does the roguelike elements fairly well, since it does a fairly good base level design and mechanics. To go with its flying around shooting at things, the flak cannon was pretty ridiculous when I last played it though. So I see this game called Space, with all its A's, and I make eye contact with the developers, and I smile and say, "Ooh, what's this game about?" And they smile back and they say, "Well, it's a third-person cover shooter." And so I laugh, because I assume that obviously a game that's clearly telegraphing to be a space sim would not be the most bland and generic genre of the modern era. But it turned out when I sat down and played it that it was in fact a third-person cover-based shooter. And I mean, I've played Gears of War, and honestly the biggest enjoyment that I got out of Gears of War was the terrible writing and the way that the camera mimics bad cinematography whenever you start running. It does the shaky cam for no reason other than to make you feel like you're in a really crappy war movie, and that made me laugh endlessly when the game first came out. Though the active reloading is a nice visceral addition to gameplay that doesn't add a particularly large amount of depth, but does have that little bit of extra immersion when you're playing. Anyway, Space did not have reloading of any kind. It had an overheating system like the Mass Effect games, or at least Mass Effect 1 did. And as I went through the first couple of rooms, and I tripped on something and died, and had a very, very, very long time until respawn, which the devs noted was a problem that they're going to work on. They then made this experience where I was expecting a space sim and got a third-person cover shooter even worse, when they said, "Yeah, we're basically aiming to be the Dark Souls of third-person shooters," which was absolutely an indicator that really they probably don't understand the appeal for people who first played Demon Souls and Dark Souls, which is there's this weird game willing to take risks and present this strange, brooding, miserable world and a very environmental, rich, atmospheric experience. And instead, this was a third-person shooter with a very bizarre, garish palette that didn't really gel with anything. It all felt very like people just starting to get a hand of how to model stuff and color stuff, which is fair enough when you're in the indie games room. So I played that game for a bit, and I got through what they said was the super hard area by basically backpedaling and just being just at the edge of aggro ranges of enemies, whereas they intended people to run in and hide behind the chest-high walls and all that stuff, but the chest-high walls kept bugging out on me, and I like to play any game that's professing to be hard as pragmatically and slowly as I can. So that's what I did, and I got through it, and they were quite enthralled, and I gave them a bunch of feedback on various elements of the game. Probably my favorite weird little thing, and you see a lot of this sort of weird stuff if you get involved with testing games in development, was there wasn't actually parity between the crosshair and the gun. The gun was lower on the screen than the crosshairs were. So there was and since they'd actually coded projectiles for all the guns rather than hit scanner effects, it resulted in a situation where the projectiles are coming out of the gun, but if you're on things like slopes, you couldn't actually target things that were in your crosshair until you'd physically moved your body up high enough so the gun was over the edge of the ledge, which was an interesting little moment, and something that I honestly think is a bit unexplored in shooters, and you could probably make some neat level design around if you were feeling particularly inspired. The other game that I played was one called Ballistic NG, which is available, it's in early access on the Steam store and is free to play, and it's a Wipeout tribute that very much wears its influence on its sleeve. Right down to things like there is a toggle option in the menu for 2280, yes or no, which replaces the game's visuals with their current high polygon equivalents with a lower resolution, lower poly count Wipeout 3 art style, as well as mimicking the physics of Wipeout 3 and the terrible, terrible draw distance, which was probably the part I found the most entertaining and kept switching that toggle on, because I liked seeing these trees and these buildings which only appear right before I'm going to run into them. Probably my favourite part of playing that game was I found a big bunch, particularly in 2280 mode, of just really wonky collision boxes, which resulted in me just consistently finding ways to just fall through the floor. Of course, it's a game which has been fairly robustly programmed, so if it recognises you've gone out of bounds, it just immediately counts you as having fallen off and puts you back on the track, so it wasn't really a problem. It was just amusing that there were certain scenes that I was consistently going out of bounds in. The other thing I'll just mention about that is it really reminded me of the differences between F-Zero as a series, particularly X and especially GX, and the Wipeout series. And basically the way to understand the difference between these two and why some people really, really prefer F-Zero over Wipeout and vice versa, is that in Wipeout, your vehicle essentially controls like a car, whereas in F-Zero, it controls more like a jet. And what I mean by this is when you steer in Wipeout, the front of your vehicle turns to the left or right. Whereas in F-Zero, when you steer, you actually lean to the left or right and bank in directions and use your air brakes to get your more dramatic turns. In particular in GX, there's a technique where you tap an air brake that's opposite to the direction you want to turn and then immediately tap the direction you do want to turn with the air brake. And that will result in you basically jackknifing yourself, doing a very rapid turn around the corner, which is a big part of how that game feels so fluid and so fast all the time, because it means there's very little deceleration around corners. Which is particularly worth noting because a lot of the track layouts had things like, in Ballistic NG, had things like free boost points directly before a corner, which is a really interesting piece of design, because it's one that's very, very video games, but really unintuitive to real life, because regardless of whether you're just driving safely around corners, going fast in a race, or in some sort of drifting competition, what you need to do when driving is you decelerate or at least stop accelerating as you enter a corner, and it's as you're halfway through a corner that you actually accelerate out of it. And so putting a booster right before the corner feels like it was designed by people that aren't actually drivers, though at the same time, I kind of like the idea and feel it's a bit unexplored, the idea of actually using boost points as hazards. And having racing lines designed where there's actually really, really suboptimal booster placements, which are designed to trap people who are trying to work out what to do, just because when you play a more arcadey racing game, you assume that any boost point is a good point and you always want to hit it. So, that's basically my thoughts from the... Oh wait, no. I also played an indie game called Goat Punks, where you are goats who climb a mountain, and the aim is to stay on top of the mountain and run down a King of the Hill timer and shoot little balls to knock people down who are coming down. I didn't like the game at all. I like a lot of weird, abstract arcade versus games. I like Windjammers. I like Towerfall, which I'll be talking about a bit later. I like Nidhogg. I like Stardust Vanguards, and probably need to play that game with people more. I like those sorts of games, but this game did nothing for me. It felt like the worst sort of the second worst sort of Mario Party minigame. The worst ones are obviously the ones that are just purely random number generation. Like the, pick which thing you think will win the race, and it's entirely random, and there's no way of indicating what is good. It's usually the Boo in Mario Party 2, except for the time that you decide to pick it. So that was my Indie Games Room experience. The rest of the con was basically calling brackets, manning the stream, or doing commentary on the AvCon stage. And if you saw any of my stream, it was a bit of a blow-up over the weekend. I had all my video settings horribly wrong, had a bunch of hardware issues, a bunch of software issues as well. For some reason, my stream overlays have all forgotten what transparency is. And so, if I say fire up my scoreboard right now and move it up into my priorities, let's do this. There we are. That's what my stream overlay is currently doing. So, I need to get that fixed, and I'll probably go mug Kai about that at some time. If you haven't seen any South Australian Smash Brothers streams, Kai does an excellent job with those. So, like I said, I like to get a finger on the pulse of what's happening in SA amongst more casual players at things like AvCon, and I can happily say that Street Fighter V attendance was actually up from last year. I believe we had about 25 last year and was closer to 40 this year. So, for all the naysaying about Street Fighter V, there is still some sustained interest in the game, and that's always people that you can bring in and play other games if they eventually become disillusioned with Street Fighter V. The tournament culminated with Dookie versus Chan. That's not particularly surprising, that's a pretty common occurrence in SA events at the moment. And Falco wasn't there, so I believe he was too busy sleeping and being a shut-in, as he sometimes likes to do. So Dookie won it pretty darn hard and clean, which is why he's a sponsored player now. Shoutouts to Yusuf for being his manager. And that was some pretty nice matches. I might as well post in the chat so it'll pop up on the VOD the link to the bracket for that tournament. There we are. Now look at that. That's beautiful. And so that makes me optimistic towards South Australia. I mean, it's just been events at ESG. SXE is coming. There might even be some other official SAFGC monthlies coming sometime soon, hopefully. And the other two games that were run were Guilty Gear and Tekken. Street Fighter V was on the Sunday. Guilty Gear was on before it. Guilty Gear I'll talk about now. Here's a link. I played pretty terribly. It's not surprising. I've been a bit unenthused about Guilty Gear. For the moment, that's fine. That's happened to me before. It's partly character pick issues, partly just that there's lots of other exciting games on, but Guilty Gear will always be there waiting for you when you return to it. And the top 3 was pretty much the vintage SA at this point. Nurk in first, Giggles in second, Pichy in third. A couple of people like Gary didn't turn up in time, so that probably could have caused some different things. I'd just like to put over Kevin, A-List1. His level of play has really, really improved over the last year. And a lot of that is because he's been net playing a lot more than the rest of us. So, although net play is always going to have its issues, you can improve so much at just certain types of decision making when you're playing online a lot more. And he's been doing so, and it's really starting to pay off. As for other things in the tournament, there was a point where I was just mucking around and picking stupid characters. Then Nurk picked Bedman, then I lost to Bedman. Then Nurk decided, Bedman's paying off, I'm going to keep playing it against Alex. And beat up Alex a big bunch. And the final matches wound up, they've uploaded to my YouTube now. The last few games of that set are actually really, really cool, and the clutch finale is one for the ages. Then finally on Saturday, there was Tekken. And this is always an interesting one, because there have been some years where Tekken's had barely anyone. Then there's other years in SA where Tekken gets like 60, 70 entrants. And this was one of those years we got 55 people. A lot of them didn't really know what they were doing. They were just hitting buttons in Tekken. But the top 4 was basically all people who have been rocking up to ESG and playing. And the winner was Destroyer, who I believe has been training a lot with people like Dion over in Sydney. And his Bob is really good. His neutral game and his movement aren't particularly smart, but he knows his frames and he knows his buttons. So if you've never seen my Tekken play, which is probably not surprising, I learned a bit of Leo in 6 and just carried that over to Tag 2 the few times I hit buttons in that, and Tekken 7, which I don't own yet, so I do not know any combos, and I was still bopping people with just purely a poking game by Leo, and so I tried to get away with all those pokes, and as soon as I did something a little bit risky, boom, he had that 13 frame punish, he had that back turn punish, or that side turn. He wrecked me in the right sort of way. They went, okay, this guy's got it, and I think he's going to beat the guy who was the favourite, I guess, entering that tournament, which is a guy called Takeshi. And in the end, that's exactly what happened. Takeshi picked, I believe, every Mishima except Heihachi at some point in winners and grand finals, and they all got wrecked by Destroyer. Destroyer basically only lost a set in grand final because he started picking subs just to see how far they could get. Then he went back to Bob and just destroyed him. So there is some potential in the Tekken scene, and I hope that those guys are going to OHN, because they'll be able to learn so much, and get SA to have a bit of a Tekken spot on the map again. That would be nice. I guess the other thing I could mention that is a bit of an interesting point is attendance for fighting games feels a bit down, has felt a bit more down over the last few years at things like AvCon. And that's probably a lot to do with the floor plan, because in the early 2010s, there were basically only one entry point and one exit point for the entire con. And so in order to get out, you had to go past everything. On top of that, the very first thing that was accessible after you've gone through the exhibitors hall was the tournament sign-up desk, which meant a lot of people just looking for games to do would see the desk and see the line that's building up and go, oh, I guess that's the place to be for games. And a lot of real nobodies would just pop up into the tournaments as a result of that. Whereas now, there's a lot more exit points, and the tournament sign-ups is way at the back with the tournament area. And so the only people who are going there now are people who are actually somewhat interested in entering tournaments. And so we're getting, although the attendance is a bit down from the days of getting like 128 Street Fighter 4 brackets, most of those people who pop up will actually hang around. There's a lot less no-shows at the roll call, and a lot less people disappearing after getting eliminated the first time, not understanding a double elimination bracket. You still get some, but it's way, way, way less, like 5% of entrants, rather than the 15 to 20 that we could sometimes get. I presume Smash 4 was a blow-up. I'm not here to talk about Smash at AvCon. That's a very long and storied and wonky history of conflicts of ideals, conflicts of logistics. Just, it's Smash Brothers at a convention. It's always going to be a bit messy. If you would like to hear my voice a bit more in relation to the AvCon event, I'll post the link to the Nidhogg VOD, because I was resting my voice after doing a bunch of Tekken and the like throughout the day on Saturday. And then I had the guy who was running the Nidhogg event run up and say, hey Pichy, can you commentate Nidhogg on the stage? So got up there on the stage and talked a bit of smack and made a bunch of Castlevania jokes. If you want to hear me doing pretty much purely color commentary, then that's certainly something to check out, and probably something that I should nick some highlights of and make into a little demo reel at some point. While I'm here, I might as well mention Nidhogg, because Nidhogg 1 is this fascinatingly pure game. The only real divergence you can have, the only real choices are the 4 stages, which do have some fairly different strategies and tactics that you can employ on them. But otherwise, that's it. It's all just how good you and your opponent are at expressing yourselves through the mechanics and getting a lead on each other. And it's worth mentioning because the game had a very long development time, which was the result of the developers trying lots of ideas and throwing a lot of them out and just focusing on fine-tuning what mechanics made the game the most exciting to play and the most deep to play. Whereas Nidhogg 2, they've decided to go stuff it. Let's focus entirely on breadth. Let's just throw as much stuff as we can in the game. New weapons, new movement types, lots of wacky things. And I guess I'm not a fan of the art direction in Nidhogg 2. But I can kind of respect that it embodies the sort of maximalist breadth approach that game is taking. Hey, we've already got perfection in Nidhogg 1, so let's just throw a bunch of goofy stuff in here and see what works and what doesn't and what people wind up liking. And if it blows up, well, hey, we can always go do something else, knowing that we've really explored this concept as much as we can. And finally, for Avcon Talk, I also ran a Towerfall Ascension tournament. This is the 3rd year I've done it. The first year I ran it, Burnout won, because Burnout was down for whatever reason to check out the con. He won Mortal Kombat, though that's a blow-up story I can tell another time. Anyway, I taught Burnout the game that day, and I taught him how to plink dash, where in that game, dashes, if you input a dash a few frames after inputting the first dash, then the dashes will cancel into each other and maintain momentum. And so I taught him to plink dash using all 4 of the dash buttons available on a PS4 controller. And then he got to Grand Final and just plink dashed his way up to his opponents, who was a friend of mine, and stole all his arrows and then killed him over and over again. So that friend of mine got 2nd that year. He then got 2nd last year when I wound up winning the tournament. I was in the winner's side of the bracket, and he did reset the bracket. He did reset it in Grand Final, but then I came out on top anyway, so he got 2nd last year. And this year, I got put into loser's bracket by a guy from Bury who'd come down and wanted to play some Towerfall, and he was pretty good. And he put me into losers, and my friend was in the winner's side of the bracket, and he made it to Grand Final in that winner's side. Then I ran it through losers and beat him again. So, 3 years of running up. He got 3rd in Ultimate Gamer this year as well, which was a Ultimate Gamer with probably the lowest amount of fighting games we've ever put in that thing. I guess Meteos is probably the closest that we had. I'm not sure if I've talked about Towerfall much on this channel, but if you've ever wanted to play, it is a really good air dash game. It's got 8-way air dashing, so you like Magneto. Air dashes are also a form of parry, which allow you to parry projectiles, which is one of the only 2 ways that you can really kill people, the other being to jump on them. Towerfall is awesome. It's got no net play, so it's a game that you have to play at offline meets, and if you want to know more about that game, next time you see me at an event, if it's OHN or if it's SXC or something, ask me for some Towerfall, and I'll sit down and teach you that game, and it is really cool. The PC version is the best one, because not only is there an 8-player variant of the game available, but the game also saves its replays in animated GIF form. If you've ever seen, there are periods on my Twitter where I'll just start looking at current events and relate to them with Towerfall GIFs. That's why, because that's their replay saving function. It's wonderful. Next up, we have Evo Talk. I have written here in my notes. So, the Evolution series happened on the previous weekend. If you haven't begun your journey of looking through the VODs, you can have hours upon hours upon hours of VODs to watch. Of mainstream games, of obscure games, of anime games, whatever. If you want some particular highlights to look out for, if you don't know anything about the player Cameo, he's a guy who plays a ton of games. And so if you go look up a lot of the anime Evo side tournaments, Cameo will pop up a lot and just bop people. That's cool. The other thing is, Hokuto no Ken had this hilarious moment where, in the middle of a Ray player setting up his Basque setup and doing his bog standard infinite, The guy got his rhythm going, started the bouncing, and the other player just started to try to offer him a financial bribe to stop the combo. And then the guy let go of his stick, refused the bribe, and then went back to doing the combo. So, as always, Hokuto no Ken is a brilliant form of performance art, and that was a good example. The Gundam side of things at EVO, I haven't watched enough of, but it was really good. Bamco decided to give it some official support and re-uploaded the VODs directly to their channel. So hopefully as Gundam Versus goes on, there will be a decent amount of support for that game, though I will mention as a side note here, Gundam Versus, I'm very worried about its future here in Australia, because as we briefly touched on last episode, for some inexplicable reason the game has a much higher base user upload requirement than previous games did. And I really, really do not know why. You should not have to be uploading that much data at any time to find out what's going on. So that might actually be the number one thing that breaks us, is that most of the time people simply cannot net play that game together. So we'll need to have venues which have decent upload rate. Unless there's some way to actually just run it purely over a local area network. Then we'll be good. That's enough about Gundam. Goodbye for now, Atra. Other things you should check out. If you like BlazBlue, and you haven't watched the BlazBlue yet, you should watch the BlazBlue. If you don't like BlazBlue, and you haven't watched the BlazBlue, you should watch the BlazBlue. BBCF has a very interesting and unique flow. I've talked before about how I feel that all the Arc System Works games very much are well and truly their own unique beasts at this point. And the BBCF finals really, really illustrated just what sort of game BlazBlue is. Because although it is a ruthless, scumbag, nasty game, it's also a game where you have to be really careful and bait out the guard cancel overdrives all the time. And then once you've done so, or someone's actually done stuff using an overdrive, and it's worn out, if they didn't get the active flow and the fast recovery on their burst, then if you've taken someone's burst, or baited out their EA and blocked it, that entire next round, basically, they have to hold it every single time that they're blocking. And then the BlazBlue nonsense really kicks in, and any time that someone blocks a lot of that stuff for a long time in a row, that is really exciting. So the game has this really unique approach to my turn, your turn, and a very tense flow. And when played at the top level, where people are able to give and take games, you get a really, really tense, exciting grand final. And the last time BlazBlue was at EVO as a main event, that certainly also demonstrated it. And this one was just as much, if not more so. So, if you just really like seeing good stories in fighting game events, BlazBlue Finals is way up there with the Street Fighter V one. And I will say, Pat Miller did mention once that for all that he doesn't like Street Fighter V, and I certainly do not like that game very much, the player stories can be quite thrilling, and the story of Punk just running a train on everyone, then Tokido, grizzled vet, clutching it out with his character that no one believed could really, really win that well, that was beautiful. I mean, it's funny to be saying that we're this excited about Akuma winning a grand final in Street Fighter, but hey, that's how new games go sometimes. And anything else that I need to say about EVO before we talk about all the PR elements? Oh yeah, I got a good chuckle when Katsuhiro Harada popped up in a Bullet Club t-shirt on the stage to make an announcement, and given that he had a Bullet Club shirt, and for those who are listening who aren't quite familiar with this thing that's been popping up, it's a faction in New Japan Pro Wrestling, which is basically the evil Americans faction. Or sometimes, I guess, since they've had Irish people, the evil white guys faction. And that faction has been making a lot of merchandising moves. You can buy Bullet Club shirts at Hot Topic now, as of the last about month or so. And there's a lot of New Japan Pro Wrestling promotion in Tekken 7. You can get current World Heavyweight Champion Kazuchika Okada's costume for King, and if you do so, King Super gets replaced to be Okada's finisher. So there's a bunch of stuff like that, so I was honestly expecting something like Kenny Omega to pop up as a playable character in Tekken 7. Or he was going to say, there's a tag mode now, we've got the Young Bucks. But instead Harada popped up to advertise an Arc System Works game and an SNK boss character in Tekken. The other thing to mention about the PR stuff is, as we've talked about before, Capcom is certainly not exactly on a roll when it comes to good PR decisions over this last year. Claims that people don't know the X-Men, that people don't know Skullomania, the dreaded function topic that we discussed when Alex was on the show, all that fun stuff. And so, a lot of the PR announcements did feel like everyone getting their licks in while they can. Arc System Works announced 2 different team-based games, which cater to both Marvel 3 fans and people who might like Marvel vs. Capcom Infinite. Tekken went and announced another boss character from a different series. And Arika announced, hey look, Skullomania is back in our game. And the music that I played at the start of this episode is a song from EX Plus Alpha that Arika used in that Evo trailer for their game, which still doesn't actually have a title. And I wanted to bring up that song because in the previous trailer they used Garuda's theme, whereas this time they used Ryu's theme, which felt a bit... It might have been intentional, it might have not, but it certainly felt like a very Japanese form of passive aggression to go, ha, you know that Capcom's not giving you what you claim you want, but we know you want that Skullomania, so we're going to use the most Capcom character music from our game, and we're going to give you Skullomania. Like I said, felt like all the PR guys were getting their licks in. And that allows me to... Okay, shall I talk about... No, I'll talk about BlazBlue. So, the first thing I like about BlazBlue Cross-Tag Battle is that its acronym is BBCTB, which means that BlazBlue began with BBCT, and is now ending with BBCT. The other thing that I'll bring up about that game is that I've seen a number of people asking, well, what would it play like? What can we get from the UI? And we've seen from the UI that there was a health bar, a second person's health bar, and a meter and a KOF style meter gauge, or a X-Men vs Street Fighter style, where it was just counting up how many supers, I guess, you have. It's just stocks like that, whereas almost every Arc System Works game goes with more of a slowly filling up single bar. So that was interesting, and as always the question that comes up is, how will a game like this play? Will it have chain shift? Will it have veil off? Will it have persona breaks? Will there be persona life bars? Will it have BlazBlue active flow? And to that I would like to quickly fire up the stream engine. And let's see if I've got the volume up. There we are. So I will bring this up a bit more. Alright, here we are. And I've got here my good friend Geo Battle Colosseum. Whoa, do I have Geo Battle Colosseum here. Transform, fit to screen. Okay, there we are. Now we got Geo Battle Colosseum. If you don't know what this game is, SNK has had many crossover games. They've had Samurai Showdown games that cross over every character that's alive or dead. The King of Fighters series is all about crossing over characters from every SNK game. Yet, after the deal with Capcom, which resulted in Capcom vs SNK and then SVC Chaos, although SVC Chaos is a hot piece of garbage, some people on the design team felt like there was potential with the concept, and they wanted to explore it a bit more, so rather than renegotiating to recycle all the Capcom sprites a second time, they went, stuff it, we'll just cross over with ourselves in a different way from when we cross over with ourselves for King of Fighters games. So they made a game that was essentially SVC Chaos 2, but it's more like SVS Chaos 2. Anyway, Mr. Brig is freaking broken in this game. So I will just pull out, okay, where's Haomaru? Where is Haomaru? Is he there? No, that's Mario. There he is. And the reason that I'm firing this up is the UI of this game actually reminds me a lot of what we saw of the BlazBlue Cross-Tag Battle UI, where there is just the life bar, the other life bar, and the meters down the bottom. hello there. These aren't the buttons that I like to have. Okay, it's... Yeah, there we are. That's the Mr. Big combo. Now, Mr. Big is broken because this button is too freaking good. And this button is way too freaking good. And Lariat is just buttons rather than a directional input like it is in KOF 96 and 98 UM. But the important thing is, you can see this game has backsteps, and it has this really wonky running where it starts off like a Capcom dash, and then turns into full-fledged running. It's a lot like Philia in Skullgirls, actually. And I believe it's where Mike Z got the idea for that character. But this game doesn't really play like KOF. This game doesn't really play like Samurai Showdown, or World Heroes, or any of those games that are in there. It is entirely its own thing. And so to the answer of what will BlazBlue Cross Tag Battle play like, my answer is it will play like BlazBlue Cross Tag Battle. The design crew are gonna come up with their own ideas, and they're gonna do whatever the hell they want. The main thing is, you got a crossover game, which is recycling as many art assets as possible, with a couple of original or completely new characters, like having Ruby in it. But it's going to be an exercise in recycling art assets, while making something completely new. As for the art assets themselves, I made a joke list a while back, listing every character, which was... I can pull up the list again. But essentially the joke that I was making is that every time you get a game like Geo Battle Colosseum, since you just want to bring in the characters that are most well-known and represented from each game, you basically just wind up a cast full of Shotos and main character types. People with fireballs, uppercuts, and some sort of move that gets them in. So that was part of the reason I did the joke, but the other thing was to get across that there are a bunch of games which have 2D sprite animation in the same resolution as BlazBlue Unib and Persona 4 Arena. I do not think that there will be a Guilty Gear character in the game unless they completely redraw the sprite. So I could imagine them doing something really wacky like redrawing the Autosol sprite. But otherwise I don't think there will be any Guilty Gear characters because the resolution that Guilty Gear XX runs at is way smaller than the resolution than the 1280 by 720 that BlazBlue was made with. And so if they try to bring him in, they'll just look really, really stretched and awful. If you've ever seen what Morrigan looks like in Marvel vs. Capcom 2 and CVS 2, it'll look like that. And considering people were making jokes about that for a decade, you really don't want to see any Guilty Gear characters in it. Or Arkana Heart characters. That said, Nitro Plus Blasters has Homura from Senran Kagura, and it has Heart from Arkana Heart. So, since Arc System Works sort of have a relationship with Examu, I could see those popping up in the game, but I don't think they will because Examu, with things like the Kickstarter, which you should support by the way, is definitely trying to be their own company again and moving out of relying on Arc System Works to handle the console distribution and the publishing, which probably results in some IP finagling as well, whenever it happens. Otherwise, characters that I think could be in, technically, Shion is from Melty Blood, but she's in Unib, so that means she's already got a sprite of the right resolution, so I could see Shion popping up and being labeled as from Melty Blood. I could also see them using Akatsuki for the same reason and saying, hey look, it's an Akatsuki Blitzkampf character. Look at how many games are crossed over in this game. I could also see characters from Ogon Musokyoku, that is the Umaneko fighting game, because there is this long suspected theory that it was an uncredited outsourced job to Arc System Works to do the sprite work in that game. It's the same resolution as BlazBlue's, and it certainly has all the trappings of being Arc System Works sprite work. So I could see that popping up as well if they really want to be wacky with licenses. And then finally I made the joke that they'd put Mr. Karate from KOF 13 in because, again, same resolution, and Mr. Karate has not ruined enough games for people. I don't think that'll happen, though. But you never know. Something crazy might happen. No, Juan, there would not be characters from Hokuto no Ken, because that's the same resolution as Guilty Gear XX. And that would be like trying to put a Street Fighter 2 sprite in HD Remix. That's a terrible comparison. It'd be like putting a Street Fighter 1 sprite in, say, Third Strike. It just wouldn't work. It would look stretched and horrible. Next point. Alright, so the other thing to talk about from EVO is the Arika game. I mentioned before the PR elements of that game. I should probably mute. Have I muted the stream engine? Yes, I have. Okay, cool. I was a bit worried there because it's still playing in my speakers. So, the Arika game is pretty wacky. But if you're looking at the game and thinking, oh man, this is a game made by ex-Capcom employees that's going to have a ground-focused game, this will be my way of breaking away from Street Fighter V. There's a couple of things you need to know about the Street Fighter EX games. The first thing is that the ground game is really, really, really strong. Street Fighter EX1 is about as close to Koihime Enbu as you can get. I've said before that Koihime Enbu is this platonic ideal of a footsie game that didn't really exist, but Street Fighter EX1 is the other good example of that. If you could ever find a disc of EX Plus Alpha for the PlayStation 1, that's the console version of the game, and there's basically 3 playable characters at top level. There's Hokuto, who's a counterpick to Gief. There's Zangief, who is Zangief. And there's Blair, who has a combo which kills Hokuto. So Blair beats Hokuto, Hokuto sort of beats Gief, Gief beats Blair. But Gief also beats Hokuto anyway, most of the time. The reasons that Gief is terrifying is because his buttons are really good. His lariat is really good. In a very, very ground-based game where projectiles have horrible recovery on them. He's got a low short that combos into a super. The super is also safe on block and very hit confirmable. And he also has a spinning pile driver that has no whiff animation. So he can just get in by getting a bit of meter with some whiff lariats, doing the stomp super, which is safe, and then just running his spinning pile driver mix-up game. Terrifying character. EX2 was a bit better with that sort of thing. But the game also had much higher reward for anti-airs, because in that game, if you anti-air jabbed someone, you could do a custom combo and then kill them. The new Arika Arika has this history of this very cautious, grounded footsie game, no matter how wacky the mechanics are. So if you're expecting to have like an alternative to KOF, or a much faster Street Fighter, it is going to be a faster Street Fighter, but it's not quite going to be the game that you're probably expecting at first glance. That said, according to the people who played it, in particular Nerdjosh and FunkDoc, there are a lot of very fun, wacky things in this game. There's chain combos, so magic series, so it'll feel a bit more like playing an anime game, which will be good for people who like to hit buttons. It always feels good to hit buttons than do a super. There's some cool stuff like Hokuto's command throw actually starts a combo now. But the biggest gimmick that it has turned out is that sort of like how Street Fighter 4 pinched the guard crushes with its focus attacks from EX1, and Street Fighter Cross Tekken was pinching from EX3's tag systems. Arika have decided to pinch a Street Fighter Cross Tekken mechanic, the gems. Now, if you don't remember the horrors of the Cross Tekken gems, there was some really dumb stuff. Basically, you picked a bunch of gems, and upon performing certain feats in the game, they would activate and do stuff. Some made your frame data better. Some gave you more damage. Some made you take less damage. The really stupid one was the auto block gem, which just let you block everything for a very, very, very small amount of meter. That was a paid DLC one, and let you just negate almost every mix-up in the game entirely, especially when combined with the automatic throw tech gem. So, Arika have decided, people hated the gems for very much a PR reason, and a sense that they were making things dumbed down. The other problems was the logistics of picking out your complete customized set of gems took freaking ages. Even after they patched the UI to make it a little bit better, you still had to memorize an elaborate code to get the gem loadout you wanted. And the other problem was that when they initially announced them, Capcom really clearly wanted it to be like a mobile phone game gacha roll system, essentially. And they were going to even do things like region-specific gems. Fortunately, it looks like Arika doesn't want anything to do with any of that, but they want to explore the concept, and this will actually be the second game to explore such a concept besides Cross Tekken. Because Dengeki Bunko Fighting Climax has essentially gems for each character where each character has a certain potential, which is a buff that will occur only when they've done certain things in the match. And this is what Arika's looking with its gem loadouts as well. They had, I believe, 5 different sets of gems that you could pick. And rather than picking each gem individually, it's just, you pick this pack, or this pack, or this pack, or this pack. And they did a bunch of stuff. Some were damage buffs, some were movement speed buffs. There was one which was built around meter, where you could do stuff in order to get extra fast meter gain, and the final gem that you could activate gave you infinite meter for the rest of the match. Which in a game with guard cancels is very good. And then the final one they had was the Miracle Pack, which is basically all overtly stupid gems. But the way that you had to activate it was, you had to build up to full meter, then not spend any for 20 seconds. And then you were good. But that meant you had to basically actually respect people and block mix-ups for 20 seconds. In a game where it's really tempting to guard cancel, because apparently the guard cancels were quite effective. But the powers that you got included things like the extra damage, the unlimited meter. There was super armor, which the dev team admitted was way too overpowered in the Evo build, and they just didn't have time to fix it before arriving. And what that meant was you could basically armor through everything that wasn't a heavy punch button, much like Catherine's Lariat in Arkana Heart. Except this was just anything, so you're mashing jab and you're just beating them clean. You're doing a fireball and it beats them clean. It was amazing. And the final ability that they were experimenting with at that build was invisibility. Literal invisibility. If you had the invisible gem on, then anytime you were moving, you were invisible. And this is a game which has side steps as well as your usual jumping and running and hopping and the like. So, the idea they were going, but if you pushed a button or did any moves, then you would stop being invisible. So, the goal that they're going for is rather than like a chip style, where it's all about you can't see this mix-up approach, this mix-up coming rather, they're trying to make it more about mixing up, since there's such a strong footsie game in Arika's Fighters. It's more about playing around with the neutral and seeing what wacky stuff you can do while invisible as you approach and move around them, which has merit. It'll probably be really janky, but it's worth exploring, and it's nice to see a game willing to take that sort of risk. There will, at some point, be a public beta test, and as we have seen mentioned in the chat, yes, there will be sign-ups for the Dragon Ball Fighter Z beta tomorrow. So if you want to get in on that and test out that game, then that will be your opportunity to. I got into a Namco Bandai test before. It was the beta test for Rise of Incarnates. And that game was hot garbage. So who knows, maybe you will get to the beta. Other topics for tonight. So, Arkana Heart. I mentioned the Kickstarter before. I'm going to link the Kickstarter in the chat. There are 8 days left for you to donate. If you're not someone who really likes to buy into Kickstarters, that's perfectly fine. I like to... It's only when it's a developer I can trust. Or I think the best description is one from a piece by Heidi Kemps on Mighty No. 9, where one of her closing statements was, don't spend more than you're willing to lose. So if you're okay with losing $20 if a product winds up terrible, then go ahead and invest $20 into the project. If you're okay with losing a bit more than that, that's cool. I'd really like to see the Shark Girl in the game, just so there is an even match of characters in Arkana. I am really glad that they're going to actually make Parase finally actually playable. And as an Arkana makes sense, since that's what they did with Mildred after Arkana Heart 1. And it's always neat to see what sort of wacky stat adjustments they can do. Maybe we'll get like the wacky healing super. That'll be something fresh for Arkana Heart. It's also neat that the rebalance got approved. I really don't think there's that much they need to do. With 6 stars, it's in a really good place it is, but maybe it'll be some more Claris nerfs, some more Xenia nerfs, some buffs to Lilica and to Nazuna. Maybe Lilica will finally have 2A being a low again. Speaking of 2A's being a low, Akatsuki in Under Night in Birth ST has a 2A that's a low now. It doesn't look like one, but it is. If you're wondering why you keep getting hit, online by Akatsuki players, that's probably a big contributor. So, support Arkana Heart. It's a cool game. I was going to talk more about Under Night in Birth Est, but you know what? We've been doing this show for about an hour now, and I think I can actually say that up when I've got some players. I was thinking about having Nurk on for a show. I will probably have Fiery on for a show, and he can talk about the status of Sydney Unib, which has always been pretty strong. That game does always feel a bit to me like the SA versus New South Wales game, but Stephen has certainly leveled up in Unib. His Gordo's pretty good. He's an all-around pretty strong player. And we still have the unresolved controversy of last year's SXC to resolve at some point. Actually, no. I will talk a bit about Unist. I won't talk about the balance or the flow or the current community. But I will just put over a few things because it's so easy to complain about when developers do things wrong. PR things wrong. UI things wrong. Little convenience things wrong. And Unist does a few really nice things in the console release. First of all, you can skip the versus mode quotes at the end of fights, like Arkana Heart, so that saves a bit of time in tournaments. Second, the rematch function is the good rematch function like Street Fighter 4, Marvel 3, Guilty Gear Xrd, and so on. So, that's really good. It also, upon you picking characters, you can skip the pre-match jingle pretty much instantly, and you can even set that to be automatic. On top of that, the loading times, particularly on the PS4 version, have been really, really, really nice so far. The training mode lets you switch characters, so you don't have to spend time loading the character select assets. You can also switch the BGM from the training mode, which is the feature that more the other games that have had character selecting training mode, which is pretty much Nitro Plus and Rev 2. They haven't done that, but Unib has, so that's great. The dummy recording option has play recording as Wake Up, as a reversal, like Skullgirls, and I think Rev 2 has that. Don't hold me to that. Skullgirls definitely has it. And that's great for testing things like safe jump setups. And training mode also lets you punch in the trial mode combos. And it actually lets you play the demo of the trial mode, but have it set so it'll give control back to you at certain points in the trial. So if there's a bit of a combo that you really, really want to practice, like it's a certain link or a certain juggle timing, you can actually practice that over and over and over again. And finally, probably the greatest feature of Unist that I can talk about, without actually talking about serious gameplay, is there are player plates for net play, where you have a little picture behind your player data. They've been around in a lot of fighting games, and Under Night in Birth Exhalate put in a bunch which was all the cute girls in nice objectified poses so you can fawn over them lustily, and they have finally upgraded it so every single character in the game has one of those. So if you want to have that cute Akatsuki looking at you with that nasty come hither look of Captain Japan, you can do that now. If you want to have a Makava looking at you wistfully, you bet your ass you can do that. Let's see, French bread know what the people need. That is about it for what I wanted to talk about tonight. This is a fairly low-key, easy episode. Next week, I'll have Fiery on. He wants to talk about Ozhado Nationals. It looks like there's going to be a bunch of big announcements coming up. If you haven't registered yet for OHN, you have 6 days before the prices go up. Then you'll be up to, I've forgotten the naming that they've given for all of their price increases as you get closer to the event. It's the tier before Hollywood, though, I know that. So, 6 days, go to ozhado.net and click on the big Register Now button and sign up for OHN if you're going to go. It should be a very fun event. I'll probably aim to get Nurk on next show as well and have a jolly old chat about Unib because he's played the game a lot. He's one of the best players in the country. Very consistent results. And we have a bit of... Nurk and I have a bit of history, not just in games, but I remember the first day I made him actually watch some vids because when Unib was still called Unib and was in the 1.x series of versions, I used to link Unib a lot as a joke just because of how wackily long the combos were. And then, just as X-Late was starting to hit and it was becoming clear that the game actually has a lot of really good systems that were finally being used right, I then made him sit down with me one night and go in, hey, this is how the game actually works and this is why it's really cool. And he went, hey, this is cool. And then he wound up liking the game a lot more than me because I have a long history of salt at the game. Unib is very much a game where mistakes are easily punished and will lead into big momentum swings when they happen. And so any sort of input error or weird scrambly situation not going your way can be very, very aggravating, and I have a long history of getting really, really salty at that game. Something that I'm finally coming to peace to. So that is it for this week. Thank you for listening. I will catch you next week and talk to you again then.